Today, I'm going to walk you through the journey we've been on to better understand and improve cat welfare and population management across different countries, focusing on Australia. This work is about rethinking the way we approach unowned cats, not just through isolated interventions, but through grounded, evidence-based strategies that are built from the inside out. But before we get there, let me paint you a picture. Imagine you're standing by a river, like this one, and suddenly you hear this meowing, this yowling, this splashing coming from the water. So you jump in, because as you look, you see a cat floating downstream. So as you jump in, you scoop it up, you pick it up, and you bring it out to safety, and you bring it to the riverbank. But just as you get back to shore, you hear the sound of another cat in the water. So again, you jump into the river and rescue that cat as well. But then another cat and another cat and another cat drift into view. Before long, there's this steady stream of cats struggling against the current, floating downstream. Maybe more people arrive and rush to help, pulling them out one by one. Now you have all these wet rescued cats on the riverbank. Some people are setting up feeding stations for them. Others are maybe building shelters to put them somewhere safe and dry. Maybe veterinarians arrive to tend to any that are sick or injured. And while all of these people are feeding cats and filling shelters and tending to them, more cats are continuing to float downstream. Then suddenly one person climbs out of the water, leaving everybody else behind. And someone yells out to them, says, "Where are you going?" And that person shouts back, "I'm going upstream to see who keeps throwing all of these cats into the river." Think about the work that you do. How much of it is reactive, responding to a crisis, firefighting, solving problem after problem day after day, jumping into the river to save a drowning cat? Now imagine all the different branches and tributaries and streams connected and flowing to and from that river. And imagine how many cats are floating down all of those other routes and how many people are doing exactly the same thing as you, pulling those cats out of their part of the river day after day. Now, historically, the animal welfare sector has been much more about reacting and responding to problems than preventing them, working downstream far more than we work upstream. Now, it's easy to understand why. It's more tangible to work downstream. With this cat in front of you, you're going to help it, aren't you? We're accustomed to dealing with emergencies, bandaging wounds after we've been injured, doing something that has a result right now, as opposed to doing something that might have an impact sometime in the future. It's just easier to comprehend and to care about. But the thing about working reactively is that unless we do push upstream, unless we find a way of breaking that cycle and changing the system, we will forever be pulling cats out of the river. As we go upstream, that's where we start to see where the cats are coming from. Some are being abandoned and just left by the river. Maybe some are intentionally thrown in. And while others might just end up living and breeding on the riverbank until eventually there's too many of them and some simply fall in. Upstream is that bigger picture. Upstream is the root cause. And upstream is where we can prevent the problem from happening. Now, obviously, we can't all be working upstream. While some people are preventing problems from happening, there's always going to need people to react and respond to them when they inevitably still do. But upstream and downstream aren't two separate destinations. They're a continuum, and there are countless points along the river between the two. And the work that we do can be at any point and has value wherever it is. We just have to be honest about what we're doing and the impact that we're having, or that we hope to have. Now, at International Cat Care, the idea of pushing upstream is central to our work, and it's why we embarked on the project that I'm going to share with you today. In 2024, last year, we, supported by Batters's Global Enablers Grant, began this pioneering project in 4 pilot countries: Australia, Portugal, Greece, and Cyprus. Each country brings its own different context, but all share similar challenges: cat overpopulation, unowned cat welfare issues, and fragmented approaches. The systems need to change, but before you can try and change a system, you need to understand it. So our goal wasn't to come in with all the answers, but to really understand each system as it actually functions on the ground through the perspectives of those already embedded in it. So how do we go about that? Well, first, there was some desk-based research to frame the context of each country. We looked at everything that we could find that was already out there, laws and policies and regulations. We did literature reviews for all published data and information. We looked at things like news stories and media reports, anything that we could find that provided that country-specific context. Next, we conducted 128 stakeholder interviews across the 4 countries to gather on-the-ground views and perspectives. We spoke to a huge range of stakeholders, municipalities, local councils, city government, national government, vets, private, city, municipal and shelter, NGOs, individual rescuers, policymakers, conservationists, environmentalists, public health officials, and even more besides. And each one of these conversations was probably about 2 hours in length. So we really got to understand those views and those perspectives. And lastly, we worked with a market research company to conduct national public opinion surveys to gauge the attitudes and behaviors of the general public. And these surveys were extensive as well, and they covered all demographics from age and gender to cat ownership to the regional distribution. And in doing all of this, we captured not just the facts about the situation, but the perceptions, the tensions, the beliefs, the relationships, and the barriers. And together, this entire process gave us a comprehensive, objective, and nuanced picture of each country's system, its challenges, its blind spots, and its opportunities. The output of this project is significant. We're just finalizing all of these resources to be able to share with everyone. This process is intended to be open source and objective. And so the results in these reports and surveys and strategies that have been created as a result of them are all directly from the stakeholders in each country. Despite being a cat welfare organization, International Cat Care went into this with no agenda. This was about understanding the system and finding the direction and the solutions based solely on the insights and the understandings of the people that were involved in this process. The resources we produced, we've got individual country reports. We've got country public opinion survey reports. We've got cross-national survey comparisons. We've got demographic breakdowns. We've got an 18-month foundational strategy and a 10-year strategic framework, both of which I'll talk about in a few slides' time. And of course, we're going to be publishing academic papers on all of this as well. So there's a lot to read. I'm going to talk about the country report and just kind of go through what that looks like to begin with before we move on to some of the other things. The Australia country report, and obviously that's mirrored in the other countries as well, obviously begins with an introduction, some context, the country overview, and the summary of key findings. In the next slide, I'll go through what those top-level key findings are. But then we look at different areas and it's broken down into category. And with each one of these categories, there are many, many subcategories. So for example, public attitudes and beliefs. First of all, we talk about the stakeholder insights from those interviews, attitudes towards responsible ownership, things like looking at the urban and rural divide. Obviously, we talk about things like cat containment and ownership and enforcement and regulations. And of course, we talk about things including feral cats and their impact on wildlife. And then obviously there's the results of the public opinion surveys as well. For municipalities, governance and legislation, we look at things that include political will and council leadership or legislative gaps and any ambiguity. And of course, cat classification, looking at feral or owned or unowned or stray or roaming, and much more besides. In the veterinary sector, we look at things like trap, neuter, return, the legality, the practice of it, the veterinary perspective of it. We look at training and capacity and gaps in expertise. For NGOs, rescuers, and informal groups, we look at things that include, again, urban and rural differences. We look at remote and indigenous community engagement. We look at collaboration and conflict between groups and individuals. And of course, we look at mental health and burnout. We look at things like data and monitoring, fragmented and inconsistent systems, and things like what gets counted and what doesn't and what should. Of course, there's a whole section on wildlife and conservation concerns, and it's extensive. And it covers things that include, obviously, cats' impact on wildlife, tensions between conservation and welfare, geographical and contextual variations. But then we move on to some very important areas. What divides the cat welfare system? And these are things like philosophical divides, again, welfare versus conservation, or TNR, the legal, strategic, or moral disagreements over that, geographic and regional disparities, and stakeholder conflict and distrust itself. But finally, we also look at what unites the cat welfare system, and there's a lot. There's a shared recognition of a problem and a shared belief that it needs to be solved. There are common frustrations with fragmentation, and there is a collective commitment to doing better. So out of all of this country report, we get these key findings as well. What are these things that are the top level? Well, there's a few of them. Some negative, some positive. As I already mentioned, system fragmentation came out as a key finding across all the stakeholders. This lack of national framework that leads to inconsistent rules and unclear roles. There are these legal grey areas, particularly in relation to TNR, with outdated laws and ambiguous definitions, and it creates confusion and risk. There are sector divisions, conflicts between conservation and welfare, stakeholders that are hindering this collaboration. And there's conflicts within those sectors as well. Conservationists conflicting with other conservationists, and welfarists conflicting with other welfarists. There's urban and rural disparities, differences between resources and attitudes between urban and rural areas and across the geographies, the multiple geographies of Australia. There's this reliance on informal labor, overdependence on volunteers without adequate support that again leads into things like exhaustion, fatigue, and burnout. There is agreement on things like desexing and containment, strong consensus that neutering and containment solutions are effective and should be used where appropriate. There's an agreement that there's data deficiencies. It was a key finding that there's a lack of standardized data that hinders effective decision making from various different stakeholder groups. There was agreement that there needs to be legal reforms, calls for updated laws and strategic coordination between federal, state, and local government. But there's unity opportunities, shared commitment, and potential for enormous collaboration. So these are the top level key findings, and as I said, within the country report, they delve a lot deeper. But let's dig a little bit more into these because, there is a big picture here. And when you put all this together, two aims stood out. On the one hand, people want to protect wildlife and biodiversity. On the other, they want to make sure that cats in towns and suburbs, especially, are treated humanely. Right now, though, there's no national framework to guide this. States and councils do their own thing, often in conflicting ways. And that leaves councils on the front line, it creates public confusion, and it undermines trust. And public opinion is complicated. For many Australians, what they know about cats comes less from their daily life, like it would in Greece or Portugal, for example, where you step out of your front door and there's cats in front of you. And in Australia, it's more from things like headlines and conversation. And that makes the language that we use really important. People often hold contradictory views, feeding cats but opposing neutering, or describing them as both loved companions but also local pests. At the same time, empathy is growing in cities. Adoption and fostering have become more commonplace, especially since COVID, and there's strong support for containment and early neutering, especially when it's framed about safety and welfare. But, as I said, there are still these deep divides in the system. Conservation and welfare groups often work from very different priorities, and dialogue between them is rare, and when it is, it's often aggressive and polarized. Trap neuter return is a good example. It's technically illegal and yet also widely practiced, leaving councils and vets and rescuers in this legal grey zone. Regional differences also matter. In cities, there's more emphasis on humane preventative approaches. In rural, remote areas, cats are more often seen as a threat to wildlife or livestock, and lethal methods are often more accepted. Indigenous and remote communities add a whole nother layer to this conversation where cats can be viewed as part of communal life. A mistrust of outside resources runs deeper than maybe some of the other issues directly related to the cats themselves. Despite all that, as I said, there's so much common ground. Almost everyone, whether from councils or NGOs or vets or the public, and many conservationists as well, agree on the value of desexing where it is appropriate and effective. Containment also has wide support as long as it comes with practical help rather than punishment. And there's a shared frustration with the current fragmentation and this widespread sense that we can do better. And that willingness to improve is an important starting point. There are pressures. Much of the system depends on volunteers and small groups, mostly women, who carry out the bulk of neutering and colony care and rehoming, and they often do this with little recognition, almost no funding, and huge emotional strain, and burnout is really common. The veterinary sector has its own challenges: not enough outreach, too little high volume desexing, and a lack of recognition for shelter and community medicine. And across the board, we're missing reliable data. Councils collect information inconsistently, so it's hard to evaluate programs or hold anyone accountable for outcomes. But the way forward is clearer if we, again, separate this work into two separate tracks. In towns and suburbs, the focus is on prevention and containment and return to owner and adoption. And where lawful and chosen, TNR in carefully managed transitional programs with strict safeguards and humaneness checks and a wind-down plan once success has been achieved. In biodiversity sensitive areas, it's about fit for place conservation tools, refuges, habitat measures, all with visible humaneness checks. Alongside this, services need to be fair and accessible, co-designed in Indigenous and remote communities. We need renter-friendly containment guidance, subsidies for those who need them, and visiting vet models for people so that they can actually access veterinary care when they need it and where they need it. And moving forward, how we talk about this really matters. Demonizing phrases like a war on cats only deepens divides, causes greater polarization and animosity between the groups. Plain outcome-based language helps people come together. Monitoring should also be simple and honest. Small milestones that show, did we do something yet? And steady indicators that tell us, is something working? Published in plain English every few months. And perhaps most importantly, there's a shared recognition that the system as it stands is failing. Across all the interviews and all the survey responses, people said they wanted something that was more humane, more evidence-based, and more coordinated. And that shared commitment gives us something strong to build on. So where does this all lead? Well, I said two of the resources that we produce, there's an 18-month foundational strategy and a 10-year strategic framework. So I'm going to look at that 18-month foundational strategy first. Now, this comes out of the key findings of that report. And this looks at what are the things that are most achievable, that are going to create the foundation for the greatest amount of change, and the things that really reflect on what was most needed. And there's 5 of those in Australia. The first one is supporting stakeholders to use insight and survey data. So all of the stuff that we have done, the reports and these documents that we're producing, make sure that the data gathered through the interviews, the public surveys is accessible, understandable, and actionable for local stakeholders. This includes helping them apply it to constructive dialogue or planning or advocacy or funding and communication efforts. Next, we want to facilitate constructive dialogue across the stakeholders, create structured opportunities for respectful conversation and relationship building between groups with differing views, particularly conservationists and welfare advocates. The goal is to reduce polarization and foster collaboration. We want to facilitate humane, pragmatic, and inclusive population management solutions. So we want to support local and regional stakeholders to co-design ethical, effective, and realistic approaches to cat population management that reflect their unique localized context. And this includes blended strategies like containment and neutering and community engagement. We want to build on skills and knowledge across the veterinary and welfare sectors, strengthen the capacity of veterinarians and rescuers and welfare groups by identifying existing expertise, creating accessible training, fostering peer support networks, especially in rural, remote, and under-resourced and underserved communities and areas. We want to promote, lastly, support and help scale effective TNR models. And this is important. We want to identify and strengthen existing TNR programs, support best practice, and lay the groundwork for legal recognition of regulated TNR as part of mainstream cat population management, where it is appropriate and where it is effective. And then that leads into our 10-year strategic framework. Now, this is a long-term plan. We acquired all of this insight gathering and this information, and we know that the kinds of things that we're talking about aren't things that change overnight. So a strategic framework over 10 years is something that we need to work towards. And importantly, this is not a prescriptive strategy. This strategic framework isn't a to-do list created by us. Quite the opposite. It's a framework for change, built on the insights of the Australian voices that were part of this process. It shows the potential routes to change and the considerations that need to be weighed in order to move forward. It starts obviously with an introduction and strategic framing built again on all of the insights that were gathered. It presents a vision and a 10-year goal, again, built on those voices from Australia, what Australians themselves say they want to see and what 10 years looks like in relation to these issues. It has guiding principles, the things that are no-brainers, the things that are red lines, whether they be ethical or financial or practical principles that underpin how things should move forward. There's a whole section on the cost of inaction. You're not doing nothing now. So what happens if you continue the way you are or you don't do anything? What are the financial costs? What are the ethical costs? What are the practical costs? What is the impact of continuing along the path that you're on that then justifies a change and a pivot in direction? The next section is about strategic phases. It's that long path to long-term change. And again, as I mentioned before, it's broken down into these two tracks. You've got track A, which is towns and suburbs and the focus on prevention and containment and return to owner and adoption and TNR where appropriate and effective. Track B is the biodiverse sensitive areas, and it's about fit for place conservation tools and refuges and habitat measures, and all with visible humaneness checks. And within that, there are shared foundations. There's shared language and equity and veterinary capacity, workforce care and legal alignment and measurements and coordination that run across both of those tracks. And it's broken down, as I said, into phases. You've got phase one, which is short term. What do we want to try and achieve in the next 1 to 3 years? Building the foundations. That's where that 18-month foundational strategy fits in, but more beyond that. Phase two is medium term, the 4 to 7 years, strengthening and scaling up what we've already achieved in phase one. And then phase three is long term. What do we do in 8 to 10 years? That's embedding and sustaining these things and normalizing certain practices so that they become commonplace. We also look at strategic focus areas. These, again, are things that were identified through the insight gathering process that were seen as particularly important, required particular strategic focus. Things like language and public understanding, desexing and identification and containment, shelter management and humane care and steady recombing, TNR as a regulated and managed and transitional program where effective and appropriate, building veterinary capacity and shelter medicine practices, supporting remote, rural, and indigenous community engagement, conservation sites and habitat protection, law and policy alignment across federal, state, local, and council settings, and coordination, workforce care, small, honest measurements. All of these were focus areas. They are all interconnected. They all filter into the phases, but they are all individually identified. We then talk about monitoring and evaluation, milestones and indicators. Did we do something? And is it working in the simplest terms? We then look at risks and contingencies, broken down again by phase and by focus area. Look at early warning signs and the dependencies. Is one thing going to happen as a result of something else? And mitigation strategies. And we delve deeper into those milestones and success indicators, breaking down what success might actually look like in relation to those different focus areas, giving examples of what indicators might be considered using. We have 12 interconnected pathways to change, depending on the focus area and the stakeholder group, because we know there's multiple routes to success. This isn't a single prescriptive direction. There are different ways of getting to the same point, depending on who you are, where you are, what resources are available, and what benefits and trade-offs you have to balance in order to get there. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. We again look at quick wins, similar to the 18-month foundational strategy, but goes beyond that. We do a cost-benefit analysis, not just looking at the financial and the economic challenges and benefits, but also the hidden costs and intangible values of going forward with plans like this. We, of course, look at strategy and stewardship and long-term ownership, who's ultimately responsible for the different elements of this, and what this framework can actually do, where this ultimately leads. So where does it lead? Well, hopefully upstream. It's important to remember Australia isn't starting from zero. It's starting from a noisy conversation. But the next decade offers a real chance to make Australia calmer and kinder in how it treats cats and more confident in how it protects wildlife. The purpose of this project and this framework is to hold those realities together without blurring them, and to keep work humane and lawful, and to make progress possible in everyday life, and wherever possible, push upstream. The habits that will get us there, they're not complicated. It starts with steps that people can see and use. Explaining choices in everyday words, keeping the measures small and honest, adjusting in public when something stalls, using tools that are fit and each place and keep welfare and humaneness visible. If those habits hold, then people will notice the change in their own streets and in the places that matter the most. As I mentioned, the resources and the reports that we've written are going to be shared with everyone very soon. We're just putting the final touches on them. So what matters then is what happens next. It doesn't require everyone to agree on everything, just enough to agree on enough to act. Thank you.